stereotypes and whatnot.
The second annual Harlem Book Fair was held on July 22nd in New York City. And for more information on the Harlem Book Fair, visit www.qbr.com. Hours of nonfiction books on TV. You're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2. Next, History on Book TV features historian Stephen Ambrose, who's written a book about the building of America's transcontinental railroad. After that, Luong Ung discusses her memoir of her childhood in Pol Pot's Cambodia. Next weekend on Book TV, an encore Book Notes interview with Jean Simon, the wife of former Illinois Senator Paul Simon. Jean Simon died earlier this year. Then Barry Paris discusses Song of Haiti, a biography of Larimer and Gwen Mellon about their efforts to improve health care in Haiti. And later, a conversation about creative nonfiction with authors Edmund Morris, who wrote Dutch, and William Least Heat Moon, who wrote Blue Highways.
How do writers write? What do writers think? Some insight next Sunday on Book TV from the Mid-Atlantic Creative Nonfiction Summer Writers Conference. Edmund Morris and William Least Heatmoon share a panel discussion on their approach to writing.
The price sometimes is absolutely god-awful. In my case, my last book cost me my last marriage. Essentially, my wife presented me with the question. It's one of those questions, once the question gets asked, there's no answer that will resolve the question. If you can ask the question, you're doomed.
I think back, Dutch taking 14 years. The one I'm writing now, if I publish it next year, will have taken 20. And the one I do next, Volume 3, I looked at the contract the other day and see that it's due on September the 1st, 1986.
A discussion on writing from the Mid-Atlantic Creative Nonfiction Summer Writers Conference next Sunday, starting at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific. Only on Book TV. Only on C-SPAN 2.
You're watching Book TV. Each weekend, C-SPAN 2 offers you 48 hours of programs about nonfiction books, authors, and the publishing industry. Write to us with your comments or suggestions at 400 North Capitol Street, Northwest, Suite 650, Washington, D.C., 20001. Or call us at area code 765-464-3080. Next, from the National Press Club, historian Stephen Ambrose discusses his new book, Nothing Like It in the World. The book takes us back to the 1860s for the building of America's first transcontinental railroad. Mr. Ambrose talks about the engineers and financiers who made the railroad possible, and about President Lincoln's commitment to the project. His comments are about an hour and a half.
Well, in case you just came wandering in off the street, our speaker tonight is Mr. Stephen Ambrose. His newest book, Nothing Like It in the World. I first came across Mr. Ambrose, probably like many of you, having read Undaunted Courage. I've been a bookseller now for probably 20 years. It caused me to coin a term that I've used since, and it is, that particular book was a "don't bother me, I'm reading" book. His publisher, Simon & Schuster, was kind enough to forward me a reader's copy of Nothing Like It in the World right before my wife and I left on holiday. Part of our holiday was indeed taking the California Zephyr from San Francisco back up to Chicago. And so I savored this till when we got on the train in Merced. And you know, I was reading the introduction, and there I read that he got to ride in the cab of an engine going across that same route. I looked up at my wife and read that particular part, And she said, "My God, what I would give to do that." And sure enough, his same sentence is that, "Don't you know there are thousands of people across this country who would want to do just that?" But I have a railroad buff. I have been reading railroad histories, taking all the railway lines, probably for the last 20 years. And I got this, and I said, well, okay, you know, I don't know anything else that someone could possibly tell me about this. But then, you know, I started reading it when leaving the train at Martinez. By Davis, I was into it. By Sacramento, I said, that rascal has done it to me again. It's a don't bother me. I'm reading my book. And here, I've got the Sierra Nevadas outside. So if it weren't for the fact that he has given me so much joy for so many of his books, I think he would owe me a train trip. But this one is, again, is a Stephen Ambrose history, and well worth it. And thank you very much for coming, and please join me in welcoming Stephen Ambrose.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much. And if we're going to get anything read tonight, we better get started. So I'm going to start. And I just had one of the lines stolen from me, but what the hell, I'm going to use it again. This is from the introduction. Phil Anschluss, who owns the UP, which owns every railroad in America, as far as I can tell right now, came up to me a few years back. He said, I understand you're working on the railroads. I said, yeah, I am. All right. He said, well, what can I do for you? I said, I want to see the track from up front. I don't want to sit back in a passenger car and look out to one side or the other. I want to be up front where I can see the grade. He said, sure. And so I got to ride in the cab, going around California's Cape Horn, climbing and descending the Sierra Nevada, having experiences of sight, sound, and touch that will never be forgotten. At one point, Mr. Mike Furtney of the railroad company, who is the head of publicity for UP, said to me, and this is the line that was just stolen from me, but what the hell. You know, Steve, he said to me, there are thousands of men in this country, nay, tens of thousands, who would pay us anything we might choose to ask to be up here in this cab. I'd never before in my life heard a businessman say, we can charge anything we might choose to ask. But they could for this one. And together with my son, Hugh, and a friend, Ken Rendell, I got to ride in the cab, climbing and descending the Sierra Nevada, having experiences of sight, sound, and touch that will never be forgotten. At one point, Mike Furtney said to me what I just quoted, and then he said, you take the controls. I said, I couldn't do that. He said, yeah, the engineer will be right behind you. You take the controls. And the engineer told me, you keep this train, we were going up, you keep this train at 21 miles an hour. I didn't say 22 and I didn't say 20. Keep it at 21. So I did, as much as I could. And I got to drive the train up the Sierra Nevada. And I got to toot the whistle at every crossing. And I need to confess to you that there is no experience in the whole world that beats orgasm. But I got to tell you, tooting that whistle is a close second. Then I got permission to ride in a special train going from Omaha to Reno, number 844, the last steam engine that was in service for the Union Pacific and has now been restored and is the pride of the line. And it was a train of only 10 cars. The last car had been built for Mr. Harriman in 1898, and that's where Maura and I got to ride. Hi. And that was pretty thrilling, too, to say the least. For the most part, we rode in the cab, pulling into sidings for the night. I told him, I don't want to ride at night. I want to see. So we did. It was extraordinary. I counted up in the cab more than 37 handles and knobs on the cab's panel. None of them with an explanation of why they were there or how they worked. But the engineer, Steve Lee, who was legendary with the Union Pacific, throughout the trip, he would adjust them without even looking at the things. The engine is sacred for many reasons. It's in the cab of a locomotive that a mere man can control all that power. It is from there and there alone that a man riding a train can see ahead. It is the eyes, ears, brains, motor power, and central nervous system for the long stream of cars it is pulling along. Nearly all the towns that we pass through in Nebraska, Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada are railroad towns. And so far as I could tell, every living adult was out there on the side of the track, or on the bridges under which the train ran, or on the bluffs that it went by. People of all ages, and both sexes, every one of them with a camera. I've led a life, because of what I do, that makes me accustomed to people pointing cameras at me. Not because of me, but because of the man that I'm with, whether a movie star, or a director, or a former president, or a senator, or whatever. I've never known anything like this. The size of the crowds, their curiosity, their involvement in the scene were just stunning. Much of the time, we were paralleling Interstate 80. When the surveyors for the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific picked the route, they didn't have any helicopters. There weren't any maps. Nobody lived out there. No airplanes. They laid out that route. Now, almost 100 years later, it came time to survey for the interstate, I-80. And they had helicopters, and they had planes, and they had maps, and they had people. Almost always, more than 95% of the time, there's I-80 and there are the tracks, and they're right beside each other the whole way. So we were paralleling Interstate 80. We caused a traffic jam. We were doing 61 miles an hour. And you could watch the people when they got to the front of the line, and they would look, and then they would poke their wives, and they would get out their cameras, and they drove at exactly 61 miles an hour. At one point, we were going this way around a curve, and I looked back, and there was a traffic jam. I mean bumper to bumper. This is Wyoming. Bumper to bumper, 7 miles back. At rest stops on the interstate, I would notice that semis had pulled over, and the driver had gotten up on top of the cab with his little camera, and he was taking pictures of the train. I asked Steve Lee, the engineer, do you ever stop to take a picture of a semi? He said no. He had never done that. It was on that trip that I learned how America has lost her heart to steam-driven locomotives. So my thanks to the Union Pacific for making it possible for me and my wife, Maura, to take the trip that will always sparkle for us above all others. Next to winning the Civil War and abolishing slavery, building the first transcontinental railroad from Omaha, Nebraska to Sacramento, California was the greatest achievement of the American people in the 19th century. Not until the completion of the Panama Canal in the early 20th century was it rivaled as an engineering feat. The railroad took brains, muscle, and sweat in quantities and scope never before put into a single project. It could not have been done without a representative, democratic political system, without skilled and ambitious engineers, without bosses and foremen who had learned how to organize and lead men in the Civil War, without free labor, without hard-working laborers who had learned how to take orders in the war, without those who came over to America in the thousands from China, seeking a fortune, without laborers speaking many languages, and coming to America from every inhabited continent, without the trees and iron available in America, without capitalists willing to take high risk for great profit, without men willing to challenge all at every level in order to win all. Most of all, it could not have been done without teamwork. The United States was less than 100 years old when the Civil War was won, slavery abolished, and the first transcontinental railroad built. Not until nearly 20 years later did the Canadian Pacific span the Dominion. It was a quarter of a century after the completion of the railroad, the American road, that the Russians got started on the Trans-Siberian Railway. And the Russians used more than 200,000 Chinese to do it, as compared with the American employment of 10,000 or so Chinese. In addition, the Russians had hundreds of thousands of convicts working on the line as slave laborers. Even at that, it was not until 32 years after the American achievement that the Russians finished. And they did it as a government enterprise at a much higher cost with a road that was in every way inferior. The Americans did it first. And they did it even though the United States was the youngest of countries. It had proclaimed its independence in 1776, won its independence in 1783, bought the Louisiana Purchase, through which much of the Union Pacific ran, in 1803, added California and Nevada and Utah to the Union in 1848, through which the Central Pacific ran, and completed the linking of the continent in 1869, thus ensuring an empire of liberty running from sea to shining sea. Now, I'm skipping a lot. I'm obviously going to skip a lot. I'm not going to even begin to read the whole book, but here are some vignettes from it. This is the Central Pacific attacking the Sierra Nevada. One of the most feared stretches ran 3 miles along the precipitous gorge of the North Fork of the American River, nicknamed Cape Horn. The slope was at an angle of 75 degrees, and the river was 1,200 to 2,200 feet below the line of the railroad. There were no trails, not even a goat path. The grade would not be bored through a tunnel, but rather built on the side of the mountain, which required blasting and rock cuts on the sheer cliffs. The mountain needed to be sculpted because the railroad would be curved around the mountain. The curves that hugged the monolith were either upgrade or occasionally down. Men had to be lowered in a bosun's chair from above to place the black powder. First of all, to drill a hole for it, then to place the black powder, fix and light the fuses, and then yell to the man above to haul us up. With regard to Cape Horn, Van Nostrand's Engineering Magazine, the premier magazine for engineers of the day, said in 1870, good engineers consider this undertaking preposterous. One day in the summer of 1865, a Chinese foreman went up to Strobridge, who was the foreman for the Central Pacific. The Chinese nodded and then waited for permission to speak. When it was granted, he said that men of China are skilled at work like this. Our ancestors built fortresses in the Yangtze gorges. Would you permit Chinese crews to work on Cape Horn? If so, could reeds be sent up from San Francisco so we can weave them into baskets? Strobridge would try anything. The reeds came on. At night, the Chinese wove baskets similar to the ones their ancestors had used. The baskets were round, waist high, 4 eyelets at the top, painted with symbols. Ropes ran from the eyelets to a central cable. The Chinese went to work. They needed little or no instruction in handling black powder, which was a Chinese invention. And they went to work with a hauling crew at the top. Hundreds of barrels of black powder were ignited daily to form a ledge on which a roadbed could be laid. Some of the men were lost in accidents. We don't know how many. The CP didn't keep a record. The Chinese working men, hanging in their baskets, had to bore the holes with their small hand drills, then tamp in the explosives, set and light the fuse, and holler to be pulled out of the way. They used a huge amount of power that was shipped to them from Sacramento. The Chinese made the roadbed and laid the track around Cape Horn. Though this took until the spring of 1866, a year, It was not as time-consuming or difficult as had been feared. Still, it remains one of the best known of all the labors on the Central Pacific. Mainly because, unlike the work in the tunnel, it makes for a spectacular diorama. As well it should. Hanging from those baskets, drilling holes in the cliff, putting in the powder, placing the fuse, and getting hauled up was a spectacular piece of work. The white laborers couldn't do it. The Chinese could. If not as a matter of course, then quickly. And, at least they made it look this way, easily. Young Lewis Clement did the surveying and then took charge of overseeing the railroad engineering at Cape Horn. What Clement planned and the Chinese made became one of the grandest sights to be seen along the entire Central Pacific line. Trains would halt there, so tourists could get out from their cars to gasp and gape at the gorge and at the grade. And staying with the CP for another minute, in the fall of 1865, the CP went to work on its tunnels. Now, you need to know that California has on its eastern side the Sierra Nevada. That is granite, and it goes up very high, and you get more snow on the Sierra Nevada than you do any place else in the United States, save only Alaska. And the tunnels had to be drilled through this granite. And in the fall of 1865, the CP went to work on these tunnels. 6 of the 13 that would have to blast out before getting to the east slope were clustered in a small stretch of 2 miles at the top of the long climb. The biggest, number 6, right at the summit, within a few hundred feet of Donner Pass, with Donner Lake right down below it, was 1,659 feet long and as much as 124 feet beneath the surface. Of all the backbreaking labor that went into the building of the CP and the UP, of all the dangers inherent in the work, this was the worst. The drills lost their edges to the granite and had to be replaced frequently. One Chinese worker would hold that drill up, and then there were 2 men behind him with sledgehammers. Whomp! And the other guy, whomp! And the other guy, whomp! And that went on for 8 hours. There was room for only 1 gang at a time, 3 men to a gang. One would hold the rock drill, the other 2 would swing these sledgehammers. The drills lost their edge to the granite and had to be replaced frequently. The CP soon learned to order his drills in 100-ton lots. The man holding the drill had to be steady or he would get hit by the sledgehammer. The man swinging the hammer had to have muscles like steel. When a hole was at last big enough for the black powder to be packed in, the crew would fill it, set a fuse, yell as loud as they could while running out of the range of the blast, and they would hope. Sometimes the fuse worked. Sometimes it didn't. Often the workers had put in too much powder, and most of it blew toward them, harmlessly as far as the granite was concerned, but at great danger to the Chinese. Clement's assistant, Henry Root, explained that more powder was used by the rock foreman than was economical, for the simple reason that the workers were told that time, not money, was of the essence. At Summit Tunnel alone, 300 kegs of blasting powder a day went up. That's more than went up in a day in the Civil War. Progress was incredibly slow, with men working round the clock. This is 24 hours a day, 8 hours, 8 hours, and 8 hours. Between 6 and 12 inches was a normal 24-hour day of how much they gained. Charlie Crocker, in charge, gave orders to establish permanent work camps on each side of the summit to facilitate the round-the-clock drilling, blasting, scraping, shoveling, and hauling by the Chinese. Charlie figured there was no night or day within a tunnel. The men worked in groups of 20 or so because only a handful could work at any one time. They ate healthy, well-cooked, and tasty food, unlike the white workers on the Union Pacific. The Central Pacific provided, as did the Union Pacific, the Americans with boiled beef and potatoes, and that's all they wanted, and some salt. The Chinese demanded and got an astonishing variety. Oysters, cuttlefish, finned fish, abalone meat, oriental fruits, and scores of vegetables, including bamboo sprouts, seaweed, and mushrooms. Each of these foods came dried, purchased from one of the Chinese merchants in San Francisco. Further, the Chinese ate rice, salted cabbage, vermiculi, bacon, and sweet crackers. Very occasionally, they had fresh meat, pork being a prime favorite along with chicken. That food helped keep the Chinese healthy. The water they drank was even more important. The Americans drank from the streams and lakes, and many of them got diarrhea, dysentery, and other illnesses. The Chinese drank only tepid tea. The water had been boiled first and was brought to them by youngsters who carried 2 pails on a sturdy pole across their shoulders, and they would dip in and drink their tea. They took daily sponge baths in warm water, washed their clothes, and otherwise kept themselves clean and healthy. According to contemporaries, the white worker had a hydrophobia, which induced him to avoid any contact with water. In contrast, the Chinese are accustomed to daily ablutions of their entire person. The Chinese were ideal workers. Cheap. $3 a day. They did as they were told. Made a quick study, and after something was shown or explained to them, did it skillfully. Few, if any, strikes. The same for complaints. They did what no one else was willing or able to do. When Charlie Crocker first proposed to Strobridge, let's use Chinese, because they were getting white workers who would sign up and then get a ride up to the top of the Sierra Nevada and then desert, because they just wanted a free ride out to the gold fields. The Chinese didn't do it that way, and Crocker said to Strobridge, let's try Chinese. And Strobridge said, you're crazy. They're only that high, and they only weigh 110 pounds. They can't possibly do this work. And Crocker said, they built the Great Wall of China, didn't they? And Strobridge soon became one of their great advocates. Now to the men who made the Union Pacific, who were primarily Irishmen. Although the myth has it was exclusively, and it wasn't. There were German descendants, and there were Scandinavians, and there were Italians, and there were Russian descendants, and there were quite a lot, 500 by my own count, African Americans, newly freed slaves. The whole world worked on the Union Pacific. But the Irishmen made up maybe 50%. Another factor here is they were almost all of them veterans. They were 18 or 19 or 20 or 21 years old. They had been in the Civil War, whether in the Confederate Army or the Union Army. You look at pictures of them, very famous pictures, and you're going to see a lot of gray coats and a lot of blue coats. And these were kids who, the war was over, and I ain't going to go back to Indiana and plow. I'm not going to go back to Ohio and get behind a horse and hold that damn plow all day long, falling behind that. I want something more exciting in my life. I want something that is significant. I want to be a part of something big. In addition, they had caught that most American of all diseases, the wanderlust. They wanted to see new country, and they signed on with the Union Pacific to go to work, to build something that they knew, and they did, they could bring their grandchildren to and say, I helped build that. And there were thousands of them. 500 or more working in the grades, then 1,000, then 3,000. In 1868, in order to keep well ahead of the track layers, who eventually numbered more than 7,000, the men came to Omaha on their own, or in response to a UP advertisement that promised good pay, good food, lots of work, and a free ride. And they came from all over America. And what they had most in common was their age. Most of them teenagers or just into their 20s. One diarist noted, nearly everybody was wearing a long blue overcoat with brass buttons, or gray coats. And General Dodge, who he wasn't general anymore, he had been in the Civil War, but he was superintendent and head of construction, and the chief engineer for the Union Pacific. He said, it was the best organized, best equipped, and best disciplined workforce I have ever seen. And Dodge built a lot of railroads. And they were being attacked by Indians pretty much constantly when they were in Nebraska, and more occasionally, but still fairly often when they were in Wyoming. And the Indians had a number of objections to the building of this road. First of all, it was going through their land. Nobody had asked them, and nobody had ever paid them. And second, they knew it was bringing civilization. And that meant, first of all, army post. And that meant that they could no longer outrun the army. That a regiment could get on a train and go all the way out to Cheyenne or go on to Rollins or wherever in Wyoming and disembark from the train, and boom, they could hit the Indians just like that. And the Indians were aware of that. They were also aware that these settlements were going to come. And that spelled doom for the Indian way of life. And most of all, the Indians were aware buffalo would not cross the track. So the laying of the track across the Great Plains meant you're splitting the buffalo herd in half. So they attacked, often, and sometimes with some effect, and sometimes with great effect. But Dodge had all of these young men, 10,000 of them, that were working for the Union Pacific. They were all armed. And their foremen had all been officers in the Civil War, and they would see a hostile Indian force up on the ridge, getting ready to come down on them, and boom, like that. Those guys would switch from being railway workers to being soldiers. And they would grab their rifles and they would line up and they would repel these Indian attacks. Their food was served on long tables in a dining car. They sat on benches as at a picnic table. The meals consisted of coffee, potatoes, and boiled meat, beef. They had a herd that went alongside the track. As the track progressed, the herd went along. It took about 9 bushels of potatoes per meal to feed the men on one of the dining cars, and there were many of them. Good butter was kept at hand when possible, and occasionally even ice water. The men got their board and room at a cost of $5 per week. The room consisted of space in one of the flat cars, or on top of it after the summer heat began. The men bathed only when they were near enough to the Platte to make it possible, and that was almost never. They never washed their pants, shirts, or jackets. About a quarter of them had mustaches, another quarter had beards, a quarter had full facial hair, and the rest were clean shaven. The hair on their heads was generally long down to their shoulders. About half seemed to have smoked, mainly pipes. They were paid from $3 to $4 per day, depending on what they did. Only 1 in 4 was a track layer. Some put in the ties, or filled around them, or handled the rails, or spiked them down, or attached the fish plates to them. That was used to tie the 2 ends of the rails together. Others were graders, teamsters, herdsmen, cooks, bakers, blacksmiths, bridge builders, carpenters, masons, clerks, telegraph operators. Most of them had to be taught their jobs. But they were quick learners, and the work was so specialized they seldom, if ever, made a mistake. How hard they worked is an astonishment to us at the beginning of the 21st century. Except for some of the cooks and bakers, there was not a fat man among them. Their hands were tough enough for any job. One never sees gloves in the photographs. The jobs included pickaxe handling, shoveling, wielding sledgehammers, picking up iron rails, and using other equipment that required hands like iron. Their waists were generally thin, but oh, those shoulders, those arms, those legs. They were men who could move things, hammer things in, swing things, whatever was required in rain or snow or high winds or burning sun and scorching temperature all day, every day. Nebraska can be hotter than hell, colder than the South Pole. They kept on working. They didn't whine. They didn't complain. They didn't quit. They just kept working. They had taken on a job that is accurately described as back-breaking. It was, in addition, a job that experts said could not be done in the 10 years that had been allotted, if ever. But they were building a railroad that would tie the country together, a railroad that almost every American wanted built as fast as possible, a railroad that required much of the skill and ingenuity and organizational ability and manufacturing capacity and stick-to-it determination of all Americans. A railroad that every American, most of all those men who were working on it at the cutting edge, was damned proud of. A day's routine was something like this. In the morning, the men were up at first light. After their toilet and washing their faces and hands in a tin basin, they had a hearty breakfast and then went to work. Whether plowing, shoveling, placing ties or rails, spiking them in, or putting on the fish plates at the junction of the two rails. At noon, time was called, and they had an hour for a heavy dinner that included pitchers of steaming coffee, pans of beef soup, platters heaped with boiled beef, potatoes, sometimes condensed milk diluted with water. The men were there to eat. There was little conversation. They made a business of it. Afterward, they sat around their bunks, smoking, sewing on buttons, or taking a little nap, then back to work, with the bosses cursing and exhorting them to overcome their noontime lassitude. Time was called again an hour before dark to allow some rest. The evening meal was more leisurely. Then to the bunkhouses for card games, a smoke, lots of talk, railroad talk. It was said to consist entirely of whiskey, women, higher wages, shorter hours. And then a song such as "Poor Paddy, He Works on the Railroad," or "The Great Pacific Railway for California Hail." Then to bed, the whole to be repeated the next day, and the next, and the next. During the spring of 1866, Jack Caseman, in charge of one of the construction crews, offered each man a pound of fresh tobacco for every day that they laid more than 2 miles of track. This was done. Dan Caseman went out in the early summer to offer time and a half pay to ensure that the UP reached the 100th meridian before any other line. He also offered double wages for any 4-mile workdays. Henry Morton Stanley, who was one of the many reporters who was out there covering this, and Henry Morton Stanley is the reporter who found Dr. Livingston, I presume. And he was reporting for 2 American papers. He was impressed by the results. The workers, he said, display an astonishing amount of enthusiasm for their jobs. The workers on the CP, from the bosses down, believed there was more rain and snow in the winter of 1865-66 than had ever before been seen in California. The winter of 1866-67 was much worse. The snow came early and stayed late. There were 44 separate storms. Some of them deposited 10 feet of snow, some deposited more. At the summit, the pack averaged 18 feet on the level. More snow falls on the Sierra Nevada than any place else in the 48 states. Only Alaska gets more snow than the Sierra Nevada. Strobridge put hundreds of the Chinese to work doing nothing but shoveling the snow away to keep open a cart trail to the tunnel opening. If it had not been for the race with the UP, the CP would have closed down that winter. But the fear of losing all Utah and Nevada to their rival drove them on. The Chinese laborers dug snow tunnels from 50 to 500 feet long to get to the granite tunnels. And they lived in these igloos, is what they were. And these Chinese, for sometimes as long as 6 months, never once saw the sky. Some of these tunnels were large enough for a team of horses to walk through. Windows were dug out of the snow walls to dump refuse and let in a little bit of light. Also chimneys and air shafts. But for the most part, the Chinese worked, ate, drank their tea, gambled, smoked opium, which they did on Sundays. They got Sundays off and they smoked opium. They didn't get themselves intoxicated with it or act silly or anything like that. They just wanted to relax on that day off. So they smoked their opium and slept in the remarkable labyrinth that they were building under the snow. This was cruel work. dangerous and claustrophobic. Still, they pressed on, drilling the holes in the granite, placing the black powder and then the fuse, lighting the fuse, getting out of the way, then going back in to clear out the broken granite. There were many accidents, but I'll skip that part. It was a part of railroading, were the accidents. Now this is back to the Union Pacific. As the end of track moved on west, it was accompanied by a scene that greatly pleased the working men and would later excite Hollywood and the book writers who made epics out of the Union Pacific, led by Cecil B. DeMille. Hell on Wheels. The man who came up with the phrase, which was universally adopted, is unknown. Hell on Wheels began at North Platte, Nebraska. That village had grown from almost nothing to 5,000 inhabitants since the track stopped there for the winter of 1866-67. Most of the residents were workers waiting for warm weather. The village bulged with gambling dens, houses of prostitution, taverns, music halls, hotels, and an occasional restaurant. And I've seen a picture of it that has, of all the most improbable things in the world, a bookstore. Under 10. These establishments were run by sharks from Chicago mainly, who had put up a small investment. Canvas for a tent, some split lumber, a bar full of liquor, some money for dancers and dealers, and for the prostitutes, a little more here and there. The sharks took in large amounts. Their customers consisted of young men with whatever they had saved from their wages, whether last year's or last week's, with nothing to do, far from home and family constraints. Their chief entertainment came from getting drunk, getting laid, and losing all their money to the gamblers. What the hell? There was nothing else to spend money on, and anyway, they had a place to sleep and eat, and during the working season, they could make more money the next morning. Many of them, perhaps most, were young Irishmen. Stephen Vincent Benet wrote about them in his 1935 fable, O'Halloran's Luck. He opened, they were strong men, built the big road, and it was the Irish that did it. The grandfather of the protagonist was, quote, a young man then, and wild. He could swing a pick all day and dance all night if there was a fiddler handy. He and his buddies had left famine and England's rule behind. He liked the strength and the wildness of it. He'd drink with the thirstiest and fight with the wildest, and that he knew how to do. It was all meat and drink to him. The bear tracks pushing ahead across the bare prairie and the fussy cough of the wood-burning locomotives and the cold, blind eyes of a murdered man. They had served in the Union Army, most of them, and were accustomed to the life. Henry Stanley wrote of North Platte when it was hell on wheels at the end of track. Every gambler in the Union seems to have steered his course here, where every known game under the sun is played. Every house is a saloon, and every saloon is a gambling den. Sometimes the men protested about being cheated. When they did, they were shot. One a day or more. There was no law. Hell on Wheels moved as the end of track moved. It could be taken down and set up again in a day. Its population numbered 2,000 to 3,000. By June, Hell on Wheels was in Julesburg, a town that, quote, continues to grow with magic rapidity, vice and crime stalk unblushingly in the midday sun. It had grown from 4 men and 1 woman to 4,000 in a day. Stanley visited the place and was amazed at what he saw. I walked onto a dance house, gorgeously decorated and brilliantly lighted. I was almost blinded by the glare and stunned by the clatter. The ground floor was as crowded as it could well be. Most everyone there was bent on debauchery and dissipation. The women were the most reckless I ever saw. There are men here who would murder a fellow creature for $5. Nay, there are men here who have already done that. Not a day passes but a dead body is found somewhere in the vicinity. The so-called big tent was 100 foot long and 40 feet wide, covered with canvas, but with a wood floor for dancing. The right side was lined by a splendid bar with every variety of liquors and cigars, with cut glass goblets, ice pitchers, splendid mirrors and pictures. A full band played, apparently day and night. Gambling tables surrounded the dance floor. Fair women in light and airy garments mingled with the throng. Men paid 50 cents for a drink for their girl, 50 cents for themselves, with the dance thrown in. The whiskey for the men was watered, and it was tea for the girls, but no matter. Down it went. Back to the CP. Getting enough Chinese to work on the grades and track was so important that the directors of the Central Pacific concluded to raise their wages from $31 to $35 per month. It would cost the UP $20,000 or more per month, but with the Chinese going to Idaho, Montana, and elsewhere, it had to be done. In late May, unbelievably and unacceptably, the Chinese went on strike. This is the hardest blow we have ever had, Crocker reported. He wanted Collis Huntington to see what you can do about getting laborers from the East. Initially, it was the Chinese who were employed in grading, but they were soon joined by those engaged on the most critical part of the work, the tunnelers. The spokesman for the tunnelers said the Chinese wanted $40 per month, rather than the $35 they were collecting. And they wanted the workday reduced to 8 hours, which it was supposed to be, but the foreman had not been enforcing that rule. Further, and what was a shock for those who thought the relations between the CP and its workers were excellent, the Sacramento Union reported the Chinese wanted to eliminate, quote, the right of the overseers of the company to either whip them or restrain them from leaving the road when they desire to seek other employment. Charles Crocker was convinced that agents of the Union Pacific had inspired the strike. The UP's motive, according to Crocker, was to keep us in the mountains where they were building the road over the plains. But he couldn't prove it. For the good reason, the UP had nothing to do with the strike, which was inevitable, given the shortage of Chinese workers and the manifest need of the CP for more of them. The CP tried to entice workers, but it wouldn't pay $40 per month or reduce the hours. Charlie will go up and attend to it, E.B. Crocker assured Huntington, because if the Chinese are successful in this demand, then they control, and their demands will be increased. The CP didn't want to lose too much time on the work. But E.B. Crocker also knew that when any commodity is in demand beyond the natural supply, the price will advance. So he had sent a CP agent into the South to try to recruit 5,000 freedmen. I hope it will be successful and they will come soon. But that wasn't to be. The following day, E.B. wrote, the truth is the Chinamen are getting smart. The only safe way to beat them is to inundate this state in Nevada with freedmen, Chinese, Japanese, all kinds of labor, so that men come to us for work instead of us having to hunt them up. Good luck on that one. The next day, E.B. wrote, since my last letter, all the Chinamen on the whole line have struck for $45 and a shorter working day. He was still opposed to paying the expenses of men coming in from the East to work and thought that a Negro labor force would tend to keep the Chinese quiet, as the Chinese have kept the Irishmen quiet. But that couldn't be done. The CP was going to have to deal with the Chinese. And skipping some parts here, you're going to have to buy the book and read it. Crocker cut off their provisions. Now remember, these guys are up there at the Summit Tunnel or they're down at Reno working on this railroad, and everything comes out of San Francisco and it has to be bought by the CP and shipped up there, and Crocker just cut off their provisions. The Chinese leaders protested, but the men began to really suffer. After a week of such treatment, quote, Crocker went up to them and they gathered around him and he told them that he would not be dictated to, that he made the rules for them and not they for him. He said if they went to work right away, all would be well. But if you don't, then I'm going to pay you nothing for June and there's no food. The Chinese laborers protested, but Crocker stayed in there. And 4 days later, E.B. Crocker noted the Chinese are working harder than ever since the strike. They were, at least according to Crocker, ashamed of the strike. I don't think we will ever again have any such difficulties with them. Thus, did Charles Crocker and his partners show other employers around the country one way, theirs, of how to deal with strikers. In the eyes of the men of the Union Pacific, the Indians deserved extreme punishment, and even more. President Oliver Ames came west and raged, "I see nothing but extermination to the Indians as the result of their thieving disposition, and we shall probably have to come to this before we can run the roads safely." General Sherman hoped that it wouldn't come to that, but he was ready if it did. Henry Stanley was there at North Platte for a peace council. He heard Sherman say to the Indians, "We built iron roads, and you cannot stop the locomotive any more than you can stop the sun or the moon. And you must submit and do the best you can. If our people in the East make up their minds to fight you, they will come out as thick as a herd of buffalo, and if you continue fighting, you will all be killed. We advise you for the best. We now offer you this. Choose your own homes and live like white men, and we will help you." One of the surveyors, his name was Ferguson, was more rabid. "I have no sympathy with these red devils," he wrote in his diary, "notwithstanding the halo of romance by which they are surrounded by the people of the East, who, secure in their happy and peaceful homes, know naught of the wild and awful horrors of the West." And that was a permanent division. The people in the East part of the United States became, in the eyes of the men and women living in the West, Indian lovers. And they wanted to treat the Indians decently, without knowing what the hell they were talking about. And the men of the West, just kill them. Just get them out of here. If they won't move on reservations and be like the Pawnees and hang around the fort and let us take care of them, kill them. Get them out of here. And this is something that Ferguson wrote. "For my part," he said, "having been surrounded by too many perils and knowing too much of the savage details of Indian warfare, they must go. Let the savage strength of the demonic Indians be broken. May their dwelling places and habitations be destroyed. May the greedy crow hover over their silent corpses. May the coyotes feast upon their stiff and festering carcasses, and the sooner the better." As bloodthirsty as that was, Ferguson had the same kind of mixed emotions as most of his fellow surveyors. To a man, they loved the wildlife, the scenery, the game, the swift and clear-flowing streams, the untouched prairie and the forests, the flowers and the trees, the birds, the opportunity to ride unfettered across an unfenced prairie. And they also loved Indians, as long as the Indians stayed out of the white man's way. But they were also aware that, as the first white men, other than the mountain men, ever to come into this paradise, this Eden, this unspoiled country, they had the job of wiping it out by bringing to it the very thing that had brought them into the wilderness, the railroad. Much as they loved the wild country, they were going to tame it. Thus, Ferguson observed, the time is coming, and fast too, when in the sense it is now understood, there will be no more West. That was partly right. The West was not going to be eliminated from the maps, or from American territory, or from people's imaginations, but it surely was going to be changed. One such change was in fact already evident. In the summer of 1868, a herd of 800 Texas cattle was trailed into the vicinity of North Platte, Nebraska. The first Nebraska cow town was born. The tame was replacing the wild. As Ferguson understood, there had to be a price. One that he recorded but apparently did not understand was accidents. To UP workers, they were just a part of the job, bound to happen. Moving all those iron rails, throwing down fish plates and spikes also made of iron, swinging sledgehammers all day long, and all the other movement of goods and supplies meant accidents. How many could not be said, nor is there an accounting of how many men lost a limb or lost their lives. there's so much more to be said about these trains, and I'm really tempted to get into it all, but I want to give you a chance to ask some questions, and it's like, I want to say to you what Elizabeth Taylor said to all of her husbands. I won't keep you long. Of all the things done by the first transcontinental railroad, nothing exceeded the cuts in time and cost it made for people traveling across the continent. Before the Mexican War, during the gold rush that started in 1848 through the 1850s and until after the Civil War ended in 1865, it took a person half a year and might cost well over $1,000 to go from New York to San Francisco. They either went overland in the covered wagons with the oxen drawing them, or they sailed down to Panama, got across Panama, very great peril, the fear of getting tropical diseases, and then hoped to hell they could find a steamer going north to take them up to California, or they went all the way around South America and came back up again. And then that's months and big money. But less than a week after the pounding of the Golden Spike, a man or woman could go from New York to San Francisco in 7 days. That included stops. So fast, they used to say, you don't even have time to take a bath. And the cost to go from New York to San Francisco, as listed in the summer of 1869, was $150 for first class, $70 for immigrant. By June 1870, that was down to $100 for first class, $65 for immigrant class. This was at a time when a common laborer was making about $100 a month. And first class meant a Pullman sleeping car. The immigrants sat on a bench. Freight rates by train were incredibly less than for ox or horse-drawn wagons, or for sailboats or steamers. Mail that once cost dollars per ounce and took forever now cost pennies and got from Chicago to California in a few days. The telegraph, meanwhile, which was built beside the track as it was stipulated in the 1862 Pacific Railway Act, and which, pause for a minute and talk about the telegraph, we like to think we live in the age of the greatest change ever. And we got Bill Gates. And you know, the biggest change, and my parents thought we lived through the biggest change. We lived through the Depression, and then we went through the Second World War, and we defeated Hitler, and we defeated Tojo, and we were there when the atomic bomb came about, and we went through the biggest change. And my grandparents, they felt we went through the biggest change. We were there when Henry Ford brought out the automobile. We were there when the Wright brothers flew for the first time. Obviously, our generation. You know who went through the biggest change? The generation that lived between 1850 and 1870. They won the Civil War, they abolished slavery, and they built the Transcontinental Railroad. And in the building of that railroad, they brought in the telegraph. We think we are in instant communication today. The telegraph puts you in instant communication. You could get a message from Chicago to San Francisco, or from Los Angeles to New York, or wherever, like that. It's what made the National Stock Exchange possible, and so much else in American business that came about because of that telegraph. So the telegraph, meanwhile, could move ideas, thoughts, statistics, any words or numbers that could be put on paper from one place to another, from Europe or England or New York to San Francisco or anywhere else that had a telegraph station, instantly. The Pullman Company published a weekly newspaper called the Transcontinental for its passengers. On May 30, 1870, that's almost exactly 1 year after the Golden Spike, the paper had this item. It was a cheering incident in our smoking car last evening when one of our party, who had telegraphed to Boston to learn if his wife was well, received, after we had run 47 miles further west, this answer: all well at home, which fact was announced and loud applause followed from all in the car. Just imagine that. It's almost like a telephone. But nobody ever did that before. And now you could find out how your wife was when you're way the hell out past Salt Lake. Together, the Transcontinental Railroad and the telegraph made modern America possible. Things that could not be imagined before the Civil War now became common. A nationwide stock market, a continent-wide economy, in which people, agricultural products, coal and minerals moved wherever someone wanted to send them and did so cheaply and quickly. A continent-wide culture in which mail and popular magazines and books that used to cost dollars per ounce and had taken seemingly forever to get from the east to the west coast now cost pennies and got there in a few days. There's a scene from The Pounding of the Golden Spike that I must indulge myself in, and then I will wind up and go to your questions. They pounded in the Golden Spike. Now that was an event of unimaginable proportions, because they'd attached a telegraph wire to the Golden Spike and another one to the rail. And when that spike was driven in and the railroad was completed, the wire would go out. Out meant to San Francisco, to Los Angeles. It meant to New Orleans. It meant to Richmond. It meant to Atlanta. It meant to Washington, D.C. It meant to New York City. It meant to Chicago. It meant to Montreal. It meant to London. It meant all over the world. At the exact moment that the railroad was completed, people around the world were going to find out about it. Now, we have become accustomed to that today. We take it for granted that if there's an earthquake in China, we all know about it instantly because CNN comes on with late-breaking news. This was the first time that that had ever happened. And at the, when one of the trains, the Jupiter, moved forward over the completed rail and then backed up, and then the 119 moved over and then backed up, and it was done. There was incidentally a regiment of troops riding on the UP's train, pulled by the Jupiter, that came from Chicago and went all the way out to the Presidio in San Francisco, the first Army unit in the whole of the world to ever go the whole way by train. And that brought about a lot of changes also. Well, when the spike was driven, telegrams went out and came in. President Grant, another from Dodge to Grant, one to Vice President Schuyler Colfax, and so on. One from Dodge to Secretary of War Rollins with a nice touch. The great work commenced during the administration of Lincoln in the middle of a great rebellion is completed under the administration of Grant, who conquered the peace. And another from Dodge to Sherman saying, in part, your continuous active aid with that of the Army has made you a part of us and enabled us to complete our work in so short a time. In Sherman's reply, he said, in common with the millions, I sat and heard the mystic taps of the telegraph battery and heard the nailing of the last spike in the great Pacific Road. Indeed, am I its friend? Yes. As early as 1854, I was vice president of the effort begun in San Francisco. He was an Army officer at that time. He promised Dodge he would ride the rails from the east to the west coast as soon as possible, which he did. All honor to you, to Durant, to Jack and Dan Casement. And he later, he told Dodge that the Transcontinental Railroad, quote, advanced our country 100 years. In Salt Lake City, there were many speeches. There was one by a man named John Taylor that put the achievement in perspective. It was, Taylor said, so stupendous that we can scarcely find words to express our sentiments or give vent to our admiration. Then he did what he said he could scarcely do. He was a Mormon from England, and many of the Mormons were converted in England and came over to Salt Lake City. He was a Mormon from England and old enough that, quote, I can very well remember the time when there was no such thing as a railroad. That's impressive enough. But what came next was almost beyond contemplation to the members of the audience in 1869. Mr. Taylor said, I rode on the first train that was ever made. That was between Manchester and Liverpool, England. Taylor could recall other changes in his life, such as the time when there was no telegraph in operation. But nothing could match the experience of having ridden on the first train ever. Then being in Salt Lake City to celebrate the completion of the railroad that linked together the North American continent. The Dreamers, led by Theodore Judah. And I haven't talked about Judah, but he's in the book, I promise. There's a lot about Judah in the book. He's the man who made the whole damn thing possible. And he's the man who surveyed the route over the Sierra Nevadas. The Dreamers, led by Judah. He was called Crazy Judah. Nobody believed you could ever get a train over the Sierra Nevadas. Judah said, we can do it. And he did. The Politicians, led by Abraham Lincoln. The financiers, the congressmen, Durant and Huntington, the surveyors, led by Dodge and Day and Judah, the generals, led by Grant and Sherman, the engineers, led by Clement, Montague, Reed, and others, the construction bosses, led by Strobridge and the Casement brothers, the railroad men, the foremen, the Chinese, the Irish, and all the others who picked up a shovel or a sledgehammer or a rail, and the American people who insisted that it had to be done and who paid for it, built the Transcontinental Railroad. None of this might have happened if different choices had been made by any of the foregoing groups and individuals, but a choice made is made. It cannot be changed. Things happened as they happened. It's possible to imagine all kinds of different routes across the continent, or a better way for the government to help private industry, or maybe to have the government build and own it. But those things didn't happen. And what did take place is grand. So we admire those who did it for what they were and what they accomplished and how much each of us owes them. Okay, your questions. Yes, ma'am. Go ahead, just shout it out, I'll hear it.
Okay. What kind of medical support was provided? Was it provided by the armies of the Civil War, the medical units, or what kind of medical support?
None. None. And that was best. I mean, the doctors in the middle part of the 19th century were going to do a lot more harm than they were good. If you had to have an arm amputated, they could do that. But no, there was none. No doctors. Yes, sir.
Did the Indians try and rip up the track?
Oh, sure. Very much so. And they were successful in doing so. And they very often were able to crash a locomotive because they would pry up the track in the middle of the night and the locomotive would come through and the engineer wouldn't see this in the dark and whoomp, over it went. And then the Indians would attack and they would take everything they could out of the cars, and especially if they could find some whiskey, and that became very notorious at Julesburg in Colorado. But yes, the Indians were capable of tearing up those tracks. Now, one of the ways that the railroad got control over that was they learned to hang lanterns on the front of the locomotives. And that provided a spotlight. So you could at least see ahead and see if the track had been torn up or not. There's another factor here that I should mention, and that's time. The railroads changed so much, and one of the things that they changed was time. Before the railroads, nobody carried a watch around. Nobody cared what time it was. And you want to know when it's high noon, you look up in the sky. And when the sun is straight overhead, it's high noon. Now, that's going to be different in Chicago than it's going to come later when you get out to Des Moines. And in Des Moines, it's going to come earlier than it's going to come in Omaha, and so on. But if you're going to have, it's only one track, remember, that they laid. If you're going to have trains going in both directions, and you don't have the same time in Cheyenne as you do in Omaha, They're going to crash. And so that's where standard time came from. The railroads demanded standard time, and the Congress put in a standard time in 1879. And then we all suddenly became obsessed with time, as we still are. Time's up. Time's wasting. The train is leaving the station, and so on. Yes, sir.
What was the catalyst that got you started on this project, and what was the process that you went through to gather the information that went into this book?
Well, the process, my editor, Alice Mayhew, said when I completed my last book, he said, you got to do the Pacific Railway. How did they build it? And I said, oh, Alice, I don't want to do that. These guys were robber barons. They went out and stole the country blind. And then they used all their ill-gotten gains to get a grip on American politics, which they held on to until first the populist and then the progressive parties were formed. And I don't want to deal with these robber barons. And she said, So I read for 6 months, and I learned that I had been badly wrong. That far from being villains, these guys are heroes. And I'm talking about the Big Four. I'm talking about Dr. Renton. I'm talking about all the others that were at the top and all of the men who built the track. So that was how I got started on it. It was unlike doing my my World War II books or the Cold War, on which I've done a lot of writing. There was nobody around to interview. But it was like doing Lewis and Clark, except it was even better than doing Lewis and Clark, where I could rely only on their own journals and that of the men of the Corps of Discovery. The newspapers sent out their best reporters to cover this story, which was, with the Civil War over with, the big story. And these reporters were curious, as good reporters are, and they asked questions, and they were always looking for an angle, and they were always looking for an anecdote, and they were always looking for whatever is new. And I put my children to work reading all those newspapers. I paid them. I paid them, not enough, but I paid them. And they would copy down every item in the Salt Lake paper, or the New Orleans paper, or the New York paper, or the Chicago paper, or the Omaha paper, or wherever. And that's right. And I also went to the archives of the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific and so on, including here in Washington. I spent a fair amount of time at the Library of Congress. I did it just like anybody else does a history book, except that I just knew those reporters were going to be pure gold, and they were. That story about Mr. Taylor, which I just love, I found it was about an item that big in the Salt Lake paper the day after the Golden Spike was pounded in. Yes?
Project important for reconciliation of the
Oh, very much so. It brought about reconciliation, first of all, among the men themselves. Confederates and Yankees learned to work side by side, and they either had to or get out. I mean, you can't lay a rail if you're fighting with the guy that you're doing it with. And they learned how to get along and became reconciled within the whole country. New Orleans got tied up in this. Richmond got tied up in this. Atlanta got tied up in this. All the cities of the old Confederacy, they wanted, and when the final celebrations came, when the wire said the road is completed, there were parades in every city in the country. More cannons boomed, so they say, I don't know how anybody can ever prove this, than there were at the Battle of Gettysburg. And that included Southern cannon as well as Northern cannon. Yes, the railroad, the binding of America together, east and west, brought America together north and south more than anything else. Yes, sir.
Is there any accounting of what happened to the descendants of the workers on the railroad in terms of, did they remain behind where they were working, or they went back home to India?
Many of them went to work for other railroads. Once the first line was built, then you got the Northern Pacific, the Great Northern, the Southern Pacific. There was a lot of railroad building going on after this. And many of the Chinese and quite a lot of the Irish went to work on it. At one point in time in the West, where almost every town west of the Missouri River has been founded by the railroads, there was a Chinatown. They're almost all gone today. victims of discrimination, and the Chinese desiring to live in San Francisco. But yeah, I know what happened to the Chinese. They continued working for the railroads for the most part, and I know what happened to most of those Irish. They continued working for the railroads. And one of the things I discovered in doing this book, there's nothing like railroading. Men who work for the railroads grow to love it. They're in awe of that locomotive. And they feel the greatest pleasure in being in some way in charge of all that fabulous machinery. And they stick with the railroads. And then their sons or their daughters go to work for the railroads. And then their grandsons and granddaughters go to, and it keeps on going down. Railroad men are the most loyal. I know a lot of people in this country. I don't know anybody that sticks to that profession in the way, that is, if he's a steel worker or if he's a farmer or whatever, as the railroad workers do. Yes, sir.
Would you review the compensation that the railroads received from the government in terms of...
The compensation was an alternate section of land for the whole way. Now, that was pretty good in Nebraska, because you could sell 160 acres. You could sell 160 acres in Nebraska for $2.50 an acre or even more. Once they got past Cheyenne, Wyoming, you know who owns most of the land? The federal government owns most of the land in this country. They're the biggest landowner by far. And it's because nobody's going to buy that land. And you know who's second? The railroads. They still hold all kind of land in Wyoming, in Utah, in Nevada. Who the hell is going to pay good money to buy 160 acres in Wyoming? You're going to need at least 2,000 acres if you're going to run a herd of 10 cattle. So the railroads still, so that's what they got. It's often said that the railroads are paid way more than it cost to build them. Bull. It's exactly the opposite. The government also loaned the railroads government bonds for every 20 miles of track built. I don't know, about $1 million in bonds. But this was a loan. And the railroads had to sell those bonds. And then they had to pay the government back. And they did, as scheduled, within 30 years, at a very high rate of interest. This was the best bargain the U.S. government ever made until the GI Bill of Rights. It was the best. It opened the West. I mean, why is it that Nebraska is one of the great agricultural producers in the whole world? It's because of the railroad. And the railroad wouldn't be there if the government hadn't stepped forward to support, as it did with these loans. You couldn't get capitalists to invest. The first place, you were getting 6% per month on a loan during the Civil War. And who the hell is going to loan money to a railroad that's building into a desert? So the government had to do what it did, and it was a terrific bargain for the government. Yes?
What did the steel and coal companies make all it?
The congressional requirement was that all the rails you buy have to be American. And guess who had a foundry that made rails? Thaddeus Stevens, who is Speaker of the House. And, and it just, Pennsylvania industry went like that with this railroad. The railroad was the cause of the biggest scandal of the 19th century, the Credit Mobilier scandal. And stocks were handed out to congressmen, and it was just pretty awful. And the Credit Mobilier paid a 200% dividend in 1 year at a time when they weren't paying their workers, that the UP wasn't. So it was a very big scandal, and it is the taste of that scandal that has lingered on even to the end of the 20th century. And there are very many Americans, and I used to be one of them, who hate the Union Pacific because of what it did. But that's not right, and it wasn't like that, which I'm trying to help people understand in this book. Yes, sir?
Given the fact that the Civil War sort of changed the American character and politics, perhaps, did the railroad change American politics in terms of opening up the country? Was the politics different after the railroad was built than before?
Well, sure it was. And it did a lot of things. It provided for movement, and the growth of California, which was already growing, but it just went like that when that railroad went through, and the growth of Oregon, and you get the Northern Pacific and the Great Northern and so on. The whole buildup of the western two-thirds of the United States came about because of the railroad. The railroad had a lot of other effects on politics. It made Leland Stanford governor of California, among other things. It also led to the complaints. The farmers who wouldn't have been there in the first place, who hadn't been for the railroad, were now bitching all the time about the goddamn railroad charges such rates. It's just, you can't possibly make a living when you got to pay the railroad so much per bushel of corn for hauling it out to Omaha for you. And that's what led to the Populist Party. And it led to the Progressive Party. And these railroads had the effect of getting the American people through the democratic system to take a much longer and deeper look at the relations between government and industry, and to demand that there be some accountability. So out of that, one of the things came out of the Sherman Antitrust Act, still on the books, and still being used by the government, and so on. Yeah, sure, of course it changed American politics. Yes, sir.
What did the railroad mean to President Lincoln? Why was it important to him, given the Civil War and all that was going on?
Abraham Lincoln was a railroad lawyer before he went into full-time politics. He was involved in the biggest case of all with the Rock Island, when they had built a bridge over the Mississippi River and a steamboat crashed into one of the pilings and it burned up, and the steamboat company sued the railroad. You can't put those bridges over this river. Our steamboats are going to run into them. Lincoln defended the Rock Island. And one of the things he did was say it was the pilot's fault. I mean, he crashed into the piling, but second he said the railroads have as much right to go east and west as your steamships have to go north and south. And that principle was accepted by the Illinois Supreme Court, and that's what made railroading in America. Lincoln got written into the 1860 Republican platform, support for the building of a transcontinental railroad. And that was done. He was the promoter of the 1862 bill, and then he promoted the 1864 revision, which gave even more subsidies to the railroad, because he wanted to see that railroad built and he wanted it seen fast. This book opens with Abraham Lincoln. And somebody asked me about that a couple of days ago. I said, how could you possibly open with Abraham Lincoln? I said, listen, I'm a writer. You got an opportunity to open your story with Abraham Lincoln. But in this story, Lincoln was in Council Bluffs, Iowa. It was 1859. And the man he was staying with, his name was Pusey, pointed to a man down the way on the veranda of the hotel, and he said, that's Grenville Dodge. He was 28 years old, Dodge was. And Pusey said to Lincoln, he knows more about railroads than any two men in the country. And that snapped Lincoln's head around. Let's go meet, he said. And you know, those great big long legs of his, he began striding down, and he stuck out that long arm, and he said, Dodge, what's the best route for the Pacific Railroad? And like that, Dodge said, right here, Mr. President, straight out from Omaha, right up the Platte River Valley. Why do you think so, Lincoln asked. And Dodge told him why he thought so. And from that moment on, Lincoln was fully committed to what became the first transcontinental railroad. Okay, take a couple more. Yes?
Where are you headed next, and what's the next book?
She doesn't always lead me down the path. Most times she does. My next book is a story of the B-24 in the Second World War. And it's not exclusively about, it's about a squadron and then about the bomb group. But one of the members of the squadron was George McGovern, who was a pilot of a B-24, 35 missions, got the Distinguished Flying Cross. Which most people, what? Excuse me. He's the most famous anti-bombing, anti-war advocate in the whole world. He flew bombers in the Second World War, and he did. And how do you open a story? I open with George, who was in Vienna in 1988 and being interviewed for a documentary they were doing on Austria in the Second World War, and they found out George was there and that he had bombed Austria, and they wanted to get him on, and they did. And the woman reporter said to him, now, Senator, you're famous around the world for your opposition to war, and yet you were a bomber pilot, you were killing our women and children. Don't you regret that? And George looked her in the eye and he said, no, not a bit of it. He said, I did what had to be done. I had to make my participation in eliminating Hitler and freeing you people. And so she was kind of surprised to hear him say that. And she said, you don't regret any part of it? And George said, well, there was one bomb that I do regret. What was that? Well, he had come back from a raid over Vienna. He was all shot up with shrapnel and everything, and the plane just barely limping along, and it's a good story in itself. And the crew called up to him, Lieutenant, we got a bomb stuck in the bomb bay, half in and half out. Oh, well, you can't land a B-24 with a bomb. And so they're either going to have to bail out or they're going to have to get rid of that bomb. And George told them, go to work on that bomb so you can get it loose. And they finally called up, and they were now over a part of Western Austria, rural. And they called up, Lieutenant, we got it. We're ready. Drop it, says George. And they were, by this time, because they were so badly shot up, down to about 10,000 feet, and it was a clear day, and he could see that bomb going down. He watched and watched and watched. Boom, it hit a farmhouse. And George looked at his watch, and he said, oh, shit. I'm a farmer. I come from South Dakota. I know what time farmers eat. And he regretted that very much, and he got back to base, and he was informed that Eleanor had had their first child that day. And he thought, oh my God, it's so marvelous. We've brought a new life into the world, and it's so awful. I was just responsible for killing innocent people. So I regret that bomb. Cut into the show. The documentary went on Austrian television. A while thereafter, about a month thereafter, when it was shown, there was a call at the station. And the man explained himself and gave his message, and then the station called George, and this was the message. The man who called was a farmer. And he said, that was my house, and that was my barn. And I know perfectly well that it was. I know the date, I know what time, I know that it was a lone bomber that was straggling its way back, and I watched that bomb come down. And I want you to tell Senator McGovern that I got my family out into a ditch and nobody got hurt. But I further want you to tell him that I don't care what other Austrians think today or what they thought then. I hated Hitler so much that when I saw my farm being destroyed, I thought to myself, if this shortens this war by 1 second, it was worth it. And that's the story I'm going to open with.
The government bonds. Any other, is that the extent of government involvement?
And the lands. What did the United States government have? It had a lot of land, and it had bonds that it could pay off in the future. And so that's what you got. You got land and they got bonds. That's all they got out of the government. What? Yeah, one more out here.
You obviously admire both these people and the people that you talked about in the Corps of Discovery. How would you compare the two groups?
Well, it was a different time. First of all, the people building the railroad had seen a railroad. Nobody in the Corps of Discovery had ever seen a railroad. Nobody in the Corps of Discovery had ever seen a steamboat. For the men of the Corps of Discovery, nothing moved faster than it had in Julius Caesar's time. For the men of the Transcontinental Railroad, they had steamships and they had trains. And that brought about, I mean, just think about this. Not just Julius Caesar's time, but Alexander the Great's time. There had been no progress. There had been progress in politics. The Greeks had come up with democracy, and democracy had been spread over to the United States, and there had been an American Revolution, and even the Brits were getting a little bit of democratic reform in. And so there had been some changes in politics. There had been no progress at all. In fact, there had been something of a sliding back. Do you know one of the biggest problems that the Corps of Discovery had was scurvy? And that was true of the American Army and of the American people. You know the Romans never had scurvy? Because when they sent their legions out, they always put vinegar in the drinking water. the British Navy, scurvy was a major problem with the enlisted ranks. The officers didn't get scurvy. Now, you'd have thought somebody in the British Navy would have had enough sense to say to themselves, why is that? But from what I can tell, what they said to themselves was, officers are gentlemen, and of course they don't get scurvy. But the truth is, the officers ate marmalade. They had marmalade for their bread. And the ranks didn't have marmalade. And the Corps of Discovery had scurvy. So there were a lot of changes. Now, how were they alike? How hard they worked, how strong they were, how disciplined they were, how quickly they were, and it depends, of course, on how quick you might want to describe it, but how quickly they submitted to discipline. And most of all, where they were most alike, and that's not absent in our lives today. I mean, certainly you saw it in the U.S. Army in the Second World War or in the Korean War, or come to that in the Vietnam War. Teamwork. It's kind of hard to find it nowadays, right? But these guys were absolutely committed to that fundamental knowledge that if men get themselves together, and I mean human beings, people, get themselves together, there's nothing they can't do if they do it as a team, such as get out to the Pacific or such as build a railroad out to the Pacific. Yes?
How did you reconcile the racial issues in that, having blacks and Chinese on this great undertaking? And also, what was the role of the military?
They got along fine. They were all doing the same job. And if the guy next to you is black or yellow or white, it doesn't matter if he's swinging that sledgehammer and he's pounding that spike, he's your friend. He's your buddy. And that was the attitude that they had. And so there was a great deal of mixing, and you had peoples from Italy, peoples from Scandinavia, peoples from Russia, peoples from Africa, peoples from Ireland, peoples from England, all sleeping in the same car and working at the same job. It was a model. All right, one more. Yes?
Any plans to make this book into a documentary?
I didn't set this up, folks. No, not a documentary, but Ted Turner and Steven Spielberg are making a movie out of it. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Stephen Ambrose is the author of many previous books, including Undaunted Courage, Citizen Soldiers, D-Day, and biographies of Presidents Eisenhower and Nixon. Mr. Ambrose is the president of the new National D-Day Museum in New Orleans. Simon & Schuster publishes Nothing Like It in the World. History on Book TV airs twice every weekend, Saturdays at 11 p.m. and Sundays at 8 p.m. Eastern. Next week, a discussion of Behind the Scenes by Elizabeth Keckley. Miss Keckley was a slave for 30 years. After purchasing her freedom in 1855, she was employed as a seamstress by Mrs. Jefferson Davis and First Lady Mary Lincoln. You can find more schedule information online at booktv.org. Click on History on Book TV, and there you'll find previews of upcoming programs and links to other history-related websites. "48 hours of nonfiction books on TV. You're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2. Next, Luong Ung discusses her memoir of her childhood in Pol Pot's Cambodia. After that, Biography on Book TV features Eric Larson, author of Isaac's Storm, a book about meteorologist Isaac